Okay, so let's just jump right in, shall we? Today we're going to be doing a really in-depth look, a deep dive into um, a piece of legislation, that was aimed at trying to sort of unravel some of the mysteries and controversies um, around a really pivotal, moment in American history. We're talking about the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this act, it's often just, for shorthand, we just call it the JFK Records Act. It was a really significant step towards transparency, right? It essentially mandated that, the U.S. government needed to create this huge, this massive collection of all the documents that it had that were related to the assassination of President Kennedy back in 1963.
And it wasn't just, like like federal records, right? It was much broader than that.
Oh yeah, yeah. The act was very specific, that this collection it's actually it's housed at the National Archives and Records Administration. That's now right, in Maryland. But yeah, it needed to include, not just stuff from federal agencies, but also anything that was held by, state and local law enforcement like bodies that had been involved, in any of the federal inquiries into the assassination. So, they really wanted to cast a very wide net here.
Okay, so the goal was really to just get all this information like in one place.
Yeah.
So what was the reason for this? Why did this happen almost 30 years, after Kennedy was killed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really interesting to sort of look back at what drove the passage of this act. So the final report of the Assassination Records Review Board, that's the ARRB, which was actually created by the JFK Records Act itself. The report partially credits Oliver Stone's film, the one that came out in '91, JFK,
Hmm.
which was pretty controversial. They partially credit that film with playing a role in getting the act
So
passed.
so a movie helped to get a law passed. That's kind of crazy. How did that happen?
Well, yeah. So the ARB, they said that the film basically, it popularized a version of President Kennedy's assassination that featured, U.S. government agents, people from the FBI, the CIA, and the military, like as conspirators. And so this really seemed to fuel public demand for more transparency, right? Like people wanted to be able to see the actual records for themselves, or at least what the government had, and it really kind of shows you like the power of public perception, right? Like even when it's shaped by a dramatic, sort of fictionalized interpretation of events.
So the act was kind of like a response to this, this idea that maybe there were things that had been hidden, right?
Right.
And that maybe, the public didn't have the full story. Okay, so once this law was actually in place,
Yeah.
what was its main requirement? What did it actually say needed to happen?
So the main requirement was really simple, right? It was full public disclosure. So every single record related to the assassination, it had to be released to the public by a specific date, October 26, 2017, which was, exactly 25 years after the act itself was signed into law. And the thinking was that, after that much time had passed, that the vast majority of those documents, if not all of them, should be, you, releasable, right?
Yeah.
They should be able to be made public.
But I'm sure there were some like exceptions to that rule. Like what about things like national security?
Yeah.
Stuff that's still classified.
Yeah, yeah, you're right to think that. The act, it did allow the president to postpone the release of some documents, to keep them, secret a little longer. But it was only under very specific circumstances. There had to be like a clear harm, to things like, military defense or intelligence operations, law enforcement, or the conduct of foreign relations, and then on top of that, the potential harm, it had to be like much greater than the public's interest in actually seeing the information. So a pretty high bar to clear, right?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've got this goal of full disclosure, but there were some potential exceptions. So what exactly when they're talking about an assassination record, what does that mean? Because that seems like it could be pretty vague. Like how do you even define that?
Yeah, it could have been, a real point of contention, right? But the language that they used in the act, it was intentionally broad. And then the ARRB, The review board, they actually played a really big part in actually defining it in practice, as they were doing their work. And their final definition, it was really comprehensive. Like they said, it included, all records, public and private, that document, describe, report on, analyze, or interpret activities, persons, or events reasonably related to the assassination, or and investigations of or inquiries into the assassination. So like that covers a lot of ground.
Public and private. That's really interesting. It's like they really wanted to make sure that they got everything right. Like nothing was off limits.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't just, like the the obvious government reports, that were directly about the assassination itself or the immediate investigations. Like it also included all sorts of, supplementary materials, things that could provide more context or clarification, for other documents, for example, figuring out the meaning of, code names that different agencies were using. Um, and really importantly, the ARB, the review board, they said that government agencies, they couldn't just refuse to release something just by saying, oh, this isn't relevant. Like the ARB, they were the ones who got to decide what was relevant or not, and that gave them a lot of power in this whole process.
So this ARB, the review board, they're really central to this whole thing. What exactly was like their role,
Yeah.
and how did they actually go about doing this?
So the Assassination Records Review Board, it was set up as an independent agency. Its sole purpose was to review these records and to make decisions whenever some part of the government wanted to delay the release of something, keep something secret. And they were only active for a few years, just 4 years from 1994 to 98.
So by the time that the ARB was actually formed, like what was the situation with the Warren Commission's findings? Like how much of that had actually been made public by then?
So it's interesting, right? By the time the JFK Records Act was actually passed, back in 92, a pretty big chunk of the Warren Commission's records, I mean, they were already public. Like I think it was around 98%, something like that. And then by the time the ARB, finished its work, like in 98, all of the Warren Commission documents, with the exception of individual income tax returns, they'd all been released. And even those that were released, they only had like very minor redactions, like just a few things blacked out here and there. So the ARB, they weren't starting from scratch. They were building on a pretty solid foundation of stuff that was already out there.
So it wasn't like their mission was to actually reinvestigate the assassination itself, right?
Exactly. The ARRB, they were very clear about this. Like their main mission was not to try to figure out, who actually killed Kennedy or why. Instead, they were focused on just identifying and collecting and preserving all of this, potential evidence, so that the public could scrutinize it, look at it for themselves. Their whole goal was transparency.
And how did they go about doing this, like gathering all this evidence?
Yeah.
Because that must have been a huge job.
Oh yeah, it was a massive undertaking. And they used all sorts of, different methods. Obviously they had to deal with, just mountains and mountains of documents, but they also actively sought out, and interviewed, people who had, firsthand knowledge about the events surrounding the assassination, people who had seen things. One really interesting example of this is they actually interviewed the doctors, the doctors who were at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, the ones who actually treated Kennedy's, head wound right after the shooting. And some of those doctors, they'd actually given, like closed door testimony to the Warren Commission, years before, but their statements had never been made public. And the ARB, they made sure that those transcripts, were released, so that people could actually see them. And they provided some really interesting perspectives, on the nature of Kennedy's injuries. And the ARB also, they weren't afraid to go directly to, these big government agencies like the FBI and the CIA, and basically use their authority to force them to hand over records that had, previously been kept secret.
It sounds like they're really like trying to dig deep, right, and get to the bottom of things. So did the ARB's work, did it uncover any like specific controversies or interesting findings that people might not be aware of?
Yeah, there were a few. One really notable one involved the photographs of Kennedy's brain, the evidence photos. So there was a staff report, that was prepared for the ARRB, and it actually questioned whether those photos, whether they were actually of Kennedy's brain at all. And it also suggested that those photos they might show, less damage than Kennedy actually sustained. But this idea, this claim, it was strongly refuted by one of the pathologists, a guy named J. Thornton Boswell, who was involved in the second examination of Kennedy's brain, the one that happened later. So even within the ARRB itself, there was some disagreement, about how to interpret this key piece of evidence.
That's really interesting, and it really shows you how difficult it can be, to actually interpret,
Mm.
historical materials, even when you have, experts looking at them. So what else did they find?
So they pointed out some inconsistencies in the evidence relating to a large wound that was in the back of President Kennedy's head,
Yeah.
and a lot of witnesses, both at the autopsy, and at Parkland Hospital, they all reported seeing this wound, but that didn't really line up with some of the photographic evidence, where you couldn't really see it clearly. And the ARB, they didn't really offer like a definitive explanation for this discrepancy, but they did point it out. They said, look, here's this inconsistency, and it makes you wonder, like how reliable, was the documentation of Kennedy's injuries.
It really sounds like the ARB was very careful not to offer their own conclusions about, guilt or conspiracy or anything like that.
Yeah.
They just wanted to present the evidence, and let the public decide what to make of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. People in the ARB, like Jeremy Gunn, for example, he always emphasized that it's really hard to rely on, individual memories and witness statements,
Yeah.
especially when you're talking about something that happened, decades ago. And they kept saying, it's really important to consider all the evidence, not just pick and choose the bits that fit a certain narrative. And they acknowledged that, memories can be faulty. People can make mistakes, in what they remember. And they really urge the public to look at all this material with a critical eye,
Yeah.
not just take any one piece of testimony, as absolute proof of anything.
Right. So the ARRB finished its work, and they basically said, okay, everything needs to be released by 2017.
Yeah.
So what was the situation like, leading up to that deadline? Was everything on track?
So by the time the ARB, shut down, in '98, the law said that everything, all the remaining documents, they had to be made public by October of 2017.
Mm.
But as that deadline, got closer and closer, it became pretty clear that there was still a lot of material that wasn't accessible. There were over 35,000 documents that had, parts that were blacked out, redacted, and over 3,600 of those they'd never been seen by the public at all. Like nobody outside of the government had ever laid eyes on them. So there was a lot of anticipation, and some people were worried, that maybe the government wasn't going to fully follow through on what the act required.
Yeah, that's a huge amount of stuff to still be, secret. So was anyone raising concerns about this, in the lead up to that 2017 deadline? Like, were there people saying, "Hey, wait a minute, we think that there's still some secrecy going on here."
Oh yeah, definitely. Back in 2013, John Tunheim, he was the chairman of the ARRB, the review board, and Thomas Samoluk, who was the deputy director, they wrote this op-ed, this opinion piece in the Boston Globe, and they basically said, look, we think the CIA is still holding back documents that should have been released under the act.
And I think they had a specific example in mind, right? Like something involving a CIA agent.
Yeah. They talked about the case of this guy, George Jewinite. He was a CIA agent, who had passed away. And initially the ARB, they'd said that the records relating to him, that they weren't relevant to the assassination investigation, but that was based on information that the CIA had given them. And it turned out that wasn't quite right. Like other researchers, they started digging into, some of the documents that had been released, and they realized, wait a minute, these Joe and I's records, they actually are relevant, and in a pretty big way.
So what was it about Joe and Ides that made those records so important?
Well, it turned out that the CIA hadn't told the Warren Commission, or even the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which, that was a later investigation. They hadn't told either of them that Joe Anitz's had been like the CIA's main guy, the port person for
Yeah.
dealing with this anti-Castro group. And it just so happens that was the same group that Lee Harvey Oswald, the guy who they say shot Kennedy, that was the same group that he had like this public fight with, just a few months before the assassination. So the fact that the CIA didn't disclose this connection, between them, and this anti-Castro group and Oswald, it's pretty significant, right? Like it makes you think, okay, was there something else going on here that they didn't want people to know about?
Yeah, it seems like more than just, like an innocent mistake. It makes you wonder if they were deliberately hiding something.
Yeah, and Thunheim, the chairman of the ARRB, later on he actually used the word treachery to
Yeah.
describe this. Like if the CIA had misled them, the ARRB on this one thing, then maybe they'd done it on other things too, right? And that really fueled this sense of suspicion, that maybe the government wasn't being as transparent as they claimed to be.
Mm. Okay, so we get to the 2017 deadline, and there's all this, concern about secrecy. So what actually happened? Did they release everything?
So the National Archives they started releasing the next batch of documents in July of 2017, and this first batch, it had hundreds of records from the FBI and the CIA that had never been seen by the public before. Like nobody outside of those agencies had ever looked at them. And they also released thousands more documents that had previously had sections blacked out, redacted, and they removed some of those redactions. And what was really interesting, in this first release, they included audio recordings, and these were recordings of interviews with Yuri Nosenko. He was a KGB officer who claimed that he'd been in charge of Oswald's file, back when Oswald was living in the Soviet Union. And so a lot of people, they saw that as a really big deal, like, okay, this could be really important information.
Yeah, sounds like it could be a really valuable source, for understanding, what was going on with Oswald. And then Trump got involved, right?
He did, yeah. So right around the time of the deadline, in October of 2017, he went on, social media, and he said that he was going to authorize the release of all the, quote, long blocked and classified JFK files, but he said that there would be, some further review first, just to make sure. And then he put out this memo where he basically directed, the release of all the remaining records that had been collected under, Section 5 of the JFK Records Act. But he also gave the agencies, the government agencies, he gave them until April of 2018 to appeal, if they thought that some information should still be kept secret, because of those national security concerns we talked about earlier.
So it wasn't like one big dump, of all the documents all at once. It was more like a rolling release, over a few months.
Yeah, that's right. So from October to December of 2017, and then finally in April of 2018, you know NARA, they kept putting out more and more documents, thousands and thousands of them, and they came from all different parts of the government, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and by the time they hit that April 2018 deadline, all the documents that were specifically covered by that section of the act, they were all out there. But it's important to remember that a lot of those documents, they still had parts that were blacked out, so even though they were technically public, there was still some information missing.
And then the story kept going,
Right.
right? Like even after 2018, there were more developments.
Right. So in 2021, Biden he announced that he was going to postpone any further releases, and he said it was because of all the problems with COVID, the pandemic. But he did say that they would start releasing more documents later, on a set schedule. And when they did the first release under that new schedule, in 2021, a lot of people they were kind of disappointed, because it didn't seem like there was a lot of new, really groundbreaking information in there. But then in December of 2022, NARA they released this huge batch, like over 13,000 documents. So they were making progress.
So where do things stand now? Like as of right now in 2023, is everything out in the open?
So, according to a report that came out in 2023, Nanar says that they've finished reviewing all the documents. Like they've gone through the entire collection, and they say that about 99% of them are now public in some form. But they also said that there's still about 4,684 documents that are either completely or partially withheld. So even though most of the stuff is out there, there's still a little bit that's still secret.
So after all this time, and all this legislation and all these documents being released, like, what's the big takeaway here? What did the JFK Records Act actually accomplish?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the act and all the work that the ARRB did, it led to just a huge amount of information,
Mm.
about the Kennedy assassination being made public. And it definitely, it achieved its main goal, right? Which was to shed some light on this really important event, in American history.
Yeah.
And the sheer number of documents that have been released, it gives researchers and the public, it gives them a lot to work with. They have all this primary source material that they can examine and try to make sense of.
But even with all this new information, the questions and the debates about the assassination, they haven't gone away, right? Like, just because all these documents are out there, that doesn't mean that everybody agrees on what happened.
Exactly. And the fact that there are still, thousands of documents that have redactions, or that are still completely secret, and the fact that the ARB itself, found inconsistencies, and even possible instances of deception, in the official record, all of that suggests that we may never have, a completely clear picture of what happened. There's still a lot of room for speculation and debate, and it really shows how difficult it is to truly understand, these complex events, especially when they involve, things like national security and government secrecy.
So given everything we've talked about, all this information, all these complexities, and the fact that there's still, some things that we don't know, what does this tell us about the challenges of trying to uncover the truth about history,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to things that governments have tried to keep secret, and what might still be hidden in those documents that are still, locked away. It's really something to think about.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah, it really is.